Okay, so welcome to everybody who is taking the time to join us today. We're very pleased to have you here on behalf of the AICO executive, and we're very excited for the content for today. Just to let people know that we are recording this session, and we're going to proceed with a really informative and hopefully helpful morning. So my name is Jenny Miron. I'm the chair of AICO. And I have the pleasure of starting us off this morning. I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement first. And I'm speaking from Humber College in Toronto. So my land acknowledgement is from this location in Ontario. So Humber College is located within the traditional and treaty lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit, known as the Etobicoke, the place of the elders. The region is uniquely situated along the Humber River watershed, which has historically provided an integral connection for Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Wyandot peoples between the Ontario Lakeshore and the Lake Simcoe Georgian Bay regions. It's now home to people of numerous nations. It continues to provide a vital source of interconnection for all. I also acknowledge that in this land acknowledgement that I'm a descendant of Irish and French settlers, and I'm committed to learning more about the true history of Canada and the implications it has for its citizens. So with that, I'd like to introduce our executive first, just to say a quick hello, and then we're going to get right into our speakers. And the first one is going to be Paul. So Maddie, did you want to say hello?
Sure. Hello, everyone. My name is Maddie Rahimian, or Matt Rahimian, and I'm the college liaison on the AICO executive team. Physically, I'm located in Hamilton, Ontario, the traditional land of Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe folks, but I work at Queen's University. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and it's going to be an exciting day. Thanks, Amanda.
Good morning, I'm Amanda McKenzie. I'm also on the AICO executive doing outreach and secretary position, and my home base is the University of Waterloo.
That's perfect, great. So without any more delay, I'd like to introduce our first speaker. We're very excited to have. He's up so very early at his end of Canada. And this is Dr. Paul Sopcak, who is the coordinator of the Office of Student Conduct, Community Standards and Values at MacEwan University in Western Canada. And I know that there was a short bio posted for him that hopefully you've all had a chance to look at. But what really spoke to me was one point here that he's an IIRP, which Certified Trainer of Restorative Conference Facilitation. And I actually had to Google that, Paul. So that was really kind of cool because I learned something new, that this is a graduate school dedicated to the science of relationships and community. So without further ado, I'm going to hand this over to Paul for what promises to be a really great session.
Thanks very much, Jenny, for the introduction. Thanks, Amanda, Matt, and Jenny for the invitation. And yeah, I'm going to start sharing my screen right away. And I'll also do just a tiny, let me see here, land acknowledgement, because I am coming to you from Treaty 6 territory. And I moved here from Germany, where I was born and raised in 2005. And it took me a long time to actually appreciate some of the Indigenous history here that was, almost beneath the surface. So I ride my bike to work every morning, and I cross the Saskatchewan River here. And I was kind of oblivious to the rich history that that the place has. So I want to acknowledge that I'm on the land, that the land on which I find myself is Treaty 6 territory, and that's the traditional gathering place for many Indigenous people. And I honor and respect the history, languages, ceremonies, and culture of the First Nation, Métis, and Inuit who call this territory home. And what I'm going to do now, actually, I think I probably have to stop sharing again in order to do that. Apologies for that. I'm going to throw a couple of links into the chat. If you ever come to Edmonton again, or if you come in the future, take a look at Dwayne Donald's River Walks. I just did that recently, and I mentioned that I was walking across the river here and in that area without really knowing the history. And Dwayne is an Indigenous scholar and associate professor at the University of Alberta, and he does these fantastic walks in the river valley where he unearths or uncovers some of that history. And there's actually a film was made about that. So here are just 3 little links about that. that if you come to Edmonton, you can take a look, but also if you want to learn and maybe even see whether there's something like that where you're located now as well, that would connect you more to the history of the land. Okay, then I'll start sharing again, if I can find the right slide. Here we go. Yes, okay, so I promised you that I would be talking about how to approach academic integrity with integrity and make a case that restorative practices is a good tool to achieve that. And so the question was, how can we establish institutional cultures in which our actions and interactions are motivated by, or richly motivated by, the values that we routinely mention that are associated with academic integrity, namely honesty, fairness, trust, respect, responsibility, and courage. So the International Center of Academic Integrity's fundamental values of academic integrity. So how can we establish cultures in which those values are kind of front and center, rather than just a rule compliance culture where students, do the right thing for fear of getting into trouble or breaking the rules and so on. And not just students, of course. Where can we establish a culture in which in all of our interactions, those values are front and center? And I'm quickly going to also mention why that actually matters. And then, make the case that restorative practices is a good tool to achieve that. So I'll start with just a reflection question. If you had to, how would you describe your institutions, whichever one you're working in, culture now? Is it a rule compliance culture? So is it mostly the structure, mostly authoritarian, punitive, fueled by reward and punishment, or is it a collaborative and restorative culture? So is it driven by values, for example, honesty, respect, responsibility, trust, fairness, and courage? But you can think of other values as well, of course. Is it relational? Would you describe it as a relational culture focused on community? And is there accountability within community? And so I'll let you think about that. And also we'll mention just briefly that there will be time for questions at the end, of course, but you can throw things in the chat, and then I will depend on Amanda, Matt, and Jenny to draw my attention to it, because I actually can't see it when I'm sharing. So yeah, so I don't know what your responses were in your kind of silent reflection on this. What I want to point out is that there's a distinction to be made, I think, between a rule compliance versus a teaching and learning centered approach, which we often do. We often say we have a teaching and learning centered approach. Teaching and learning is front and center and so on. But a teaching and learning centered approach can actually be solidly grounded in either of these cultures, in either the rule compliance culture or the restorative or collaborative culture. So that's one thing I wanted to point out. And then the other thing I wanted to ask, or just again throw out there as a reflection piece, is, do our approaches to academic integrity have integrity in themselves? So what I mean by that is, do we have one set of principles that we act upon when we're doing our promotion and education work, and do we then switch to a culture, a rule compliance culture, when students commit academic misconduct? So is there a change of standards and principles maybe when we switch from the prevention work to the policing work or the responding to academic misconduct? And then another thing to ask is, or does a restorative or collaborative culture make sense, or directed at students, make sense within an overall culture that's not restorative or collaborative? So our interactions with our colleagues, it's the work that HR does, is that a collaborative culture, or does that feel more like a rule compliance authoritarian culture? Is there a split between how we interact with our colleagues and how we say we interact with our students, and so on? So those are all just questions to get to get us thinking about what a culture-based, a truly restorative or collaborative culture with integrity, so not different standards for different situations, but what that would look like. And a nice tool, and I'm taking this from the IIRPs, the International Institute for Restorative Practices, their materials, actually it's Wachtel in his article, and I've got a reference in the back. I'm taking his social discipline window. It's part of the International Institute of Restorative Practices training as well, materials, and this papers as well. And it's just a nice way because it seems to intuitively connect to how we can intuitively understand these different institutional cultures, even, for example, through a parenting analogy, if we think about this. But it can be any kind of any interaction, but also especially culture of organizations. And an easy way to distinguish cultures of organizations are along two axes, so two major factors: control, and that's the y-axis in this slide, and support on the other. And control would be things like limit setting, discipline, setting boundaries, high expectations. That's an important one, right? So high expectations and so on, control. And then support would be encouragement, nurture, and support. And if an institutional culture or an interaction is high on support, high on control and low on support, then you can see it falls into that punitive, that two window, which would mean we do things to people, right? We tell them, it's a kind of a unidirectional interaction. So we have high expectations, but give little support. That would be the two window there, doing things to people. And then if we are high on support and low on control, that's permissive on the right. So it's doing things for people. That's okay. Let me fix that for you. Don't worry about it. I'll take care of it. Wasn't that bad, and so on. Doing things for people is that permissive window. And then also low expectations. And then if it's low on both control and support, we call that neglectful, not doing anything. There's no academic misconduct on our campus, right? Our students would never do that. Or even just say, there's nothing we can do about it, right? Those would be, in the context of academic misconduct, those would be kind of neglectful or not doing anything relations. And then if you look, and it's conveniently highlighted, if you look at the top right corner, there's another option that is high on control and support. And so also high expectations, but a lot of support in meeting those expectations. And that's where the term active accountability fits in. So restorative approaches in general have high expectations regarding the taking of responsibility, the fixing of any harm that was done, addressing the situation actively by the person who caused the harm or did the wrong. But they also provide a lot of support for that person to meet those expectations. And so that's doing things with people. That's that collaborative approach. And if you think about it, the people that you respect most are probably in that box. That's probably their style of interacting, is that they have high expectations, but they also provide a lot of support. And it's not new that the people that we respect, good teachers, mentors, coaches, and counselors, have always treated people like that, with high expectations and control, but also a lot of support. So it's just important, I'll throw that out there again, that a restorative approach does not mean that we decrease the amount of control or expectations. It's high expectations, lots of support. And there's just a little quote that got us thinking about this one. The fundamental unifying hypothesis of restorative practices is that human beings are happier, more cooperative and productive, and more likely to make positive changes in their behavior when those in positions of authority do things with them rather than to them or for them. And it has to, there's a Harvard Business Review piece, I think it's old already, 2005, and it talks about how people are more likely to trust and cooperate freely with systems as well. So our institutional systems, for example, whether they win or lose, when they perceive a process to be fair, and this doing things with people giving support is a key in that perception of fairness. We know that we've got procedural fairness and adjudicative fairness. That's not always perceived as fair, even though, you know, objectively, in scare quotes, that is supposed to be fair. And it has to do with the fact that there's engagement, there's an explanation, expectation, clarity. So people involved have an opportunity to say to be heard, felt heard and understood. Then any decisions are actually collaborative decisions and explained clearly to them. And then there's that expectation, clarity, and establishment of shared understanding on what is expected of them, and then, you know, in outcome agreements, that's actually written down, and everybody signs that then voluntarily. There's also a way to think about this in terms of a continuum. So when people think about restorative justice, they often think exclusively about circles, and then people meeting, and sometimes the cliche is that it's these, you know, these circles that everybody then walks away hugging, and it's, you know, kumbaya and so on. You know, that might be one form of restorative justice. But there's a whole continuum, and it has to do with, you know, it can start with just simply affective statements and affective questions. And I'll show you some of the questions that are used in that process shortly. It can be small, impromptu, what they call conferences, which would be something like a meeting where we sit together, you know, in a circle, and there's a fairly strict procedure for that. And then there's group or circle that's organized and that's been planned, and where people, you know, where there've been kind of pre-conferences. And then there's a formal conference, you know, that involves usually confidentiality agreements that are signed beforehand, outcome agreements that are signed and are binding, and so on. But a culture, a restorative culture, a collaborative culture will actually touch on each of these, or will be restorative on each point of this continuum. That doesn't mean that if you're thinking about how can I go about this at my own institution, or where are we at in relation to this, you know, this way of looking at whether it's restorative or authoritarian culture, that you can't start with one place on this continuum and then expand it in any of the directions. But it's just good to know that those principles really apply on a continuum. I wanted to briefly also tie this to ethical decision-making scholarship, and then to social emotional learning scholarship. And before I actually talk about what restorative practices are and what we've been doing at MacEwan and so on. And the scholarly literature on ethical decision-making very broadly categorizes ethical decision-making into two categories, namely reason, rationalist-based, and then intuition and or emotion-based. And the rationalist models assume that a moral reasoning process dominates the core of the model, leading to moral judgments. Those models, the reason rationalist-based models, emphasize, the rational cognitive process used by decision makers to resolve any kind of ethical situation or dilemma. And they, you know, often recognize that intuition or emotion might play a role in ethical decision making, but they don't consider that to determine moral judgments. On the other hand, intuition or emotion-based ethical decision making models do the opposite. They think that it's actually our intuition and emotions that really drive our ethical decisions, and that moral reasoning only then post hoc justifies or rationalizes what we had already kind of intuitively felt. Jonathan Haidt, you probably know him from some of the positive psychology literature. Sonnenschein, another one, pro-social, self-blame, and other blame emotions are relevant in that. But more recent literature does something like an integrated model that that holds that it's rather than reason, rational, and then intuition, emotion-based processes being mutually exclusive, or actually there being a clear hierarchy between them, you know, that one just supports the other. That idea in the integrated integrated ethical decision-making model is that there's an interaction. It's like a dynamic, almost like a back and forth of vacillation between the two, between the intuitions, emotions, and then the reasoning and the reflective piece on that. Yeah, so increasingly, and this also is now outside of the ethical decision-making literature in general in cognitive studies, they're called 4E approaches to cognition. So there's an increased perception that it's impossible to isolate the cognitive from the affective domain, because our cognition is embodied, embedded in active and extended. And all that, you know, to say that our approaches to ethical decision-making ideally would reflect or would give students an opportunity to do both, to explore their emotions, or that they would address ethical emotions, intuitions, and moral reasoning, and not just one over the other. And it's just something to think about when we design ethical decision or design education that is aimed at some kind of moral education. And interestingly, Swartz points out that, and I'm just going to read this and then talk about it a bit. What appears to be lacking in current ethical decision-making models, however, is the depiction of one's lack of moral awareness, meaning one does not realize, it means they overlook that the situation one is experiencing raises ethical considerations. So a lot of the moral or ethical decision-making literature talks about how these decisions are made, and Swartz is pointing out that what the research shows is that in order to make those decisions, we first have to be aware that there's sensitive, or have this ethical sensibility, that there's actually an ethical dimension to a certain situation, that we're now dealing with something that has an ethical import of some sign. And I would say that's especially so when dealing with academic misconduct, when not just students but also faculty members often don't explore the ethical dimensions of academic misconduct. And the whole process of a restorative resolution really addresses that piece. It really digs into what are the ethical implications of a certain case of academic misconduct, and so on. Let me see. Yeah, I think I have enough said about that. And so what are some of the strategies to promote integrity with integrity? So not having, again, those kind of different principles riding or driving our procedures for different situations, but actually having a solid foundation and having a values-based approach throughout, no matter which area of either conflict resolution, but in our institutions, but also the promotion and education work and so on. And tying this back to the ethical decision-making literature I just pointed out, it's really important, I think, that we provide everyone with experiential learning opportunities that are related to ethical decision-making, and that allow people to make mistakes. And then learn from them and correct the mistakes. That's what I should have said. And another strategy is to have social emotional learning opportunities. Those will then promote these fundamental values of academic integrity, even though they should already be kind of infused by those. And we need to kind of focus also on community and relationship building. And there, again, I think a restorative or collaborative culture that's reflected in policy and practice is a really good strategy to promote integrity with integrity. And as educators or working in educational institutions, we know that we learn most from our mistakes if we get an opportunity to truly take responsibility and fix the situation through active accountability, rather than just accept a consequence and then be kind of sent on our way with a bit of shame. To reflect on that in private. Here's just the last thing I'm going to tie it to, and then I promise I'll jump into the actual restorative practices, what that looks like. This is to tie the approach to the social emotional learning literature, and I'll again just read this longer quotation, apologies. Social emotional learning is the process by which children, adolescents, and adults acquire and apply the necessary knowledge and skills to understand and manage emotions, set goals, show empathy for others, establish positive relationships, and make responsible decisions. The definition of social and emotional learning has been recently expanded to include an equity lens, which states that through strengthening our SEL competences, we are better able to connect across race, class, gender identity, sexual orientation, learning needs, and age. I'll start with the bottom part just briefly. So I don't know if you turned on the radio this morning, there's some even more troubling kind of developments around hate crimes related to race, race-based hate crimes, but also gender hate crimes in general towards minorities and gender-based violence and so on. So there's a concerning trend. And I think our institutions and we in our institutions have a role to play in attempting to reverse that trend. There's also a literature, I'll get to that later, sorry, I won't jumping on here, but yeah, why I'm showing you this is that even though the social emotional learning literature points mostly towards the instructional environment, I think that developing a restorative or a collaborative culture touches on or provides actually the process provides this social emotional learning opportunity. And here's how to connect it to some of these metrics that the administration often wants to hear about, and that has been shown through some research here. So social emotional learning in the literature and the research is connected to academic success and retention, healthy relationships, improved mental health and well-being, which is, of course, especially important now that we see the decline in mental health, not just in our students, but also in our faculty and staff. That's the COVID-related trouble. Social emotional learning stresses importance of developing a sense of community. And here I'll quote Elmi again, social and emotional learning concerns the development of emotional intelligence skills, including self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationship skills, and responsible decision-making. And if you think about it, I think, or if you look at your institution's mission and vision statements, maybe even your strategic plans, I'm pretty sure you will find some words to that effect. So whether it's we're educating the whole student, or whether it actually addresses things such as civic education, citizenship education, those are all addressed in that little quote here. And again, restorative practices provide these social emotional learning opportunities. Okay, now I'm actually going to jump in. What is this business with restorative practices? So you can take a breath here. If you've been wondering, he's talking about restorative practices, but he's not telling us what that even is. So here, it's hard to define restorative justice and restorative practices. There are many ways to define it, but I'm going to take a quotation here from Howard Zehr, who's kind of a leading figure in the field. And restorative practices in this definition is an umbrella term, and restorative justice would be actually a category underneath that umbrella term that deals with justice or criminal justice issues mostly. So restorative justice is a process to involve, to the extent possible, those who have a stake in a specific offense, and to collectively identify and address harms, needs, and obligations in order to heal and put things as right as possible. And there are at least four underlying principles, and these are, I'm quoting, or I'm drawing this from David Karp, who's another important international figure in restorative justice, especially. And those four underlying principles, at least these four underlying principles, are inclusive decision-making, active accountability, focus on repairing harm, and rebuilding trust. And with that, you can probably already sense that that's a really good way to promote those fundamental values of academic integrity: honesty, fairness, trust, respect, responsibility, and courage. And it's not just responsive, it's not just restorative. Sometimes it's also only perceived as something that comes into play when things go wrong. But the principles of restorative practice are really culture building, and they build that collaborative culture. And then there's also feedback loop. So if we address situations where things have gone wrong restoratively, that builds a stronger community. So we're doing preventative work through that as well then. Okay. Here's another way to look at it. Restorative practices helps to reduce crime, violence, and bullying, improve human behavior, strengthen civil society, provide effective leadership, restore relationships, and repair harm. I'm going to very quickly jump into some persistent myths that surround restorative justice and restorative practices. And then I'll just talk about what we do at MacEwan for a moment, and I'll show you some videos if we have enough time. And the first myth is that it's primarily about forgiving the wrongdoer and their integration. That's not primarily the case. The focus really is on the person or communities that have been harmed, and how to repair that harm, their needs, meeting the needs of the people that have been harmed. That forgiving the wrongdoer might be a part of that, is clear, but that's not the priority. That's not primarily what this is about. And it's interesting because especially where there's a power imbalance, and when we apply a restorative approach, let's say in an academic misconduct setting, it's very easy to slip into that, this thinking, or that this is all about the person who committed academic misconduct or non-academic misconduct. And how can we now, how can we forgive them and bring them back in? But that's not the focus. That's not the primary focus of this. The second myth is that it's mainly focused on reducing recidivism. Again, that can be a byproduct, but it's not the focus. The focus is repairing the harm done to the person harmed or a community harmed, and to repair trust, rebuild community. It's also not another form of mediation. So the parties that come to the table there don't come with basically an equal, how should I say? It's not a level playing field in the sense that there's going to be an attempt to find a compromise between equally valid positions, which would be something like mediation. In restorative practices and restorative justice approaches, there's a clear responsible party who needs to take active accountability to repair the harm that they did. And there's a harm party whose needs are front and center, or harm parties and communities. So it's good to distinguish those. Then there's a myth that this is okay for less serious offenses, but not for serious ones. And actually that's just not true. So the most effective implementations of restorative justice and restorative practices are when people have a lot at stake, when they're invested in the process. So this has been used to deal with the aftermath of genocide, for example, successfully used, but it's also been used in just interpersonal relationships. But it's not just okay for less serious offenses, and it makes a lot of sense to consider it for the very serious offenses as well. It's actually on the next slide, but I'll mention it already. As long as there's no risk for further harm, that's kind of the top principle anyway, which when we're talking in academic misconduct context, that risk is usually quite low. Then the other myth is that it's much more time and resource intensive than quasi-legal or just regular quasi-legal model code procedures. And I would say that depends. I think we found a way to make that, to avoid that here. it doesn't need to be. I'll answer it that way. It doesn't need to be much more time and resource intensive. It's also not, and this is a big one, it's not an easy way out for offenders. It doesn't allow them to shirk responsibility. It's the opposite. It's actually it's a lot more difficult usually for students or anyone to participate, a responsible party to participate in this process. They have to take active responsibility. They have to reflect and share how they reflected on the harm that they caused, and they have to listen to how they've caused harm, and then respond to that. And then there's that contentious issue at the bottom that restorative justice and restorative practices are an appropriation of Indigenous legal practices. There's a good discussion that is, I would say, it can be. So I think care needs to be taken to ensure that it's not an appropriation, that there are appropriate acknowledgements when it's based on that. I think the fact of the matter is that these restorative principles and the like have been around for millennia in all different cultures, and that the current model that is used mostly in North America has strong roots in the New Zealand Indigenous community, especially. So it found its way from the Maori culture and to northern US first, I think. But this article, Chartrand and Horn, does an excellent job of showing some of the overlap and some of the differences between restorative justice and some of the Indigenous legal practices here. Okay. Restorative practices at MacEwan University. So we've implemented them into our academic misconduct procedure. So it's actually the default, on paper, the default response to academic misconduct. And then it's also now in our policy for non-academic misconduct cases. And we've worked on for a year. We're continuing to slowly and carefully work on a restorative resolution option for cases of campus sexual harm. So it's just a way of expanding something to really build a culture and a collaborative culture based on the restorative practices principles, because as one of my mentors in this area, Kevin Hood, mentioned, it really doesn't make sense to have restorative responses in a culture that's otherwise not restorative, that's otherwise maybe authoritarian in nature, punitive in nature. And it seems like what's the right word? Disjunction? No, disjointed. Anyway, it doesn't work. Here's what a process looks like briefly. So this would be just a regular restorative conference. If you think of that continuum, let's say there's a case of contract cheating, for example. These are the questions that would be asked of the responsible party. What happened? What were you thinking of at the time? What have you thought about since? Who has been affected by what you've done? In what way have they been affected? And actually, the students get these questions beforehand. I talk with them for about half an hour, even just to get a sense whether they're in a place that they are willing to take responsibility or not, because if they're not, then this process is kind of wasted on them, or could be wasted on them. And then, who has been affected, in what way have they been affected? Then I switch over and ask, or the facilitator switches over and asks the harmed parties, which can include proxies or representatives of the faculty body and the student body if there are privacy issues. So for example, if it's a repeat misconduct and the prof or the instructor who taught the course in which the second offense occurred doesn't need to know about the whole history of other offenses, then you can work with trained representatives of the faculty body and the student body, which we do, to see how to answer these questions. So what do you think? What do you think when you realized what had happened? Or if it's a representative, what do you think when you realize that cases, you and your colleagues think when you realize that cases like these have happened? What impact do these incidents have on you and other? And what's usually the hardest thing for you? And then you see here, there are these questions around, what do you think needs to happen to make things right? What are appropriate consequences? What do you think could be put in place to ensure it doesn't happen again? And I usually slide one in for the student. How can you be part of the solution to a larger problem, which then allows people to think about how some of the purely punitive outcomes or penalties might be translated into constructive ones. So where the students are actually now contributing to building a culture, to educating their peers. We know that that's one of the most effective ways of reaching peers is peer-to-peer education. Anyway, those are some of the thoughts. Just to mention, I don't know if I have a slide on this, that the outcomes are, yes, I do. Actually, it's the next one. They're focused on fairness and consistency. They're not identical to the outcomes of, let's say, a repeat misconduct hearing that's based on quasi-legal disciplinary process, but they have to be equitable. It can't be an easy way out, and students can't be kind of option shopping either. So we're fairly strict about that. And the easiest way to ensure that is that you have representatives of the faculty body or student body who you know will perceive their role as protecting the standards of academic integrity, for example, on campus, and make those demands then around what is an appropriate response. And it can be a mix of sanctions, educational, restorative activities, developing action plans, resource sheets, reflective papers, value statements, and educational material. And they're binding, because they're assigned voluntarily and they're not appealable. Now, I wonder, I'm going to try to just share a couple of videos, and then Amanda, Jenny, and Matt, you can, if I'm going too long, let me know. I want to make sure we have time for questions too, but I'm going to stop sharing this here and see if I can share a couple of videos with you. Oh, and Amanda, please just interrupt me if you can't hear or if something's wrong with the video.
Okay, Paul, thanks.
Yeah, I think the biggest difference that I noticed was that there was an opportunity to have a less formal conversation between the offender and the harmed party. I thought it was great that there was a procedure in place where both parties are asked a series of questions that prompts them to verbalize the nuances of their experiences. And I think what this led to was that it meant that both parties had to reflect more deeply on their various experiences. I guess another thing that was different was that there was an opportunity to discuss what actions could be taken to repair any harm that was done. And I guess lastly, in that there was the student ombudsperson was there not only as a support person for the student, but there to be more involved. So she could actually speak to what had happened and offer another perspective. There was a more complete sense of resolution as compared with the more traditional disciplinary process.
Okay, I'm going to show you this one too yet, and then there's one short one by a student, and then I'm going to wrap up the conversation here.
Well, restorative practices have been part of my world for a very, very long time. Many years ago, I actually wrote a course called Restorative Justice for a program here at MacEwan. I've sat on a board that facilitates restorative practices for youth in conflict with the law and also for young people in schools. I also, in 2015, was on sabbatical in New Zealand, working with the Maori, and had an opportunity to participate in something called rangatahi courts for Maori youth, which utilize restorative practices. So it's something that I've been keenly interested in for a number of years. So when the opportunity arose to use restorative practices with respect to an academic integrity issue, it was, I guess it was the opportunity for me to experience a restorative process at a very personal level. But in the interest of full disclosure, I will tell you that I actually didn't want to participate initially. I've been a supporter of this initiative at MacEwan for a very long time, But when it came to me, I was reluctant, and I'll tell you why. It was a timing issue more than anything else. It was the end of term. I was very tired. I was annoyed as well because it was not the first time that this had happened with this student, not in a course that I took, but I coordinate a program. And so I'm sometimes aware of other issues that students have. And I just wanted it to be over and done with and make the decision, pass it over to the Office of Academic Integrity and be done with it. And then it was one of those moments where you go, oh, so this is what hypocrisy looks like. And so what I decided was, it's time for you to step up, Michelle, and to, I actually reframed it is what I did. And so instead of thinking of it as an obligation, I saw it as an opportunity. And again, to be fully participatory in a process that I supported from an intellectual level, and now in a very personal level, that's what got me to that point.
And the last one is a shorter, and we'll actually end on those words by Sean Waddingham. Oh, let me see.
So what originally made me want to?
Yeah, so
begin
just in final kind of
volunteering
conclude
to be the student representative in restorative practices was a sense that maybe we could do academic misconduct discipline a bit better. I noticed, especially now with my position as VP Academic with SAMU, I kept noticing that student academic misconduct can be done by accident. Oftentimes it is. I mean, you have improper collaboration and errors in paraphrasing that people do by accident, and they can get caught up in all kinds of misconduct discipline. So I saw this as a great alternative to help students realize what they were doing wrong when it came to misconduct, how to fix that, and was maybe a better alternative than a slap on the wrist, as was traditionally done.
All right, actually what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop right here so there's time for discussions. There were a few more slides that just kind of summarize it and that talk about the goals related to academic integrity.
I would like to be part of the process because I think I actually...
There we go. More videos running. So I'll stop here and then you can look at just the summary slides when the slides are shared. Yeah, I just want to make sure there's time for questions or comments.
Thanks, Paul. That was great. I've heard you speak about this a number of times, and I think this was the best one yet. So
thanks
thank you very much. I just wrote in the chat to people that if you have a question, please type question, and we will call your name, and you can turn your video on and unmute yourself. Or if you have a question and you just want to turn your video on and unmute yourself, we can go that way as well. This is usually a very hot topic, so I'm surprised people are kind of quiet right now, but it's still early in the morning, especially for
Paul.
you.
Paul, I just have I have one question or comment. First of all, I guess practice makes perfect, back to Amanda's. So we're going to have to keep having you come and speak to us about this topic. But I'm really interested in, and I know this is a big topic, but just even if you could give us some highlights, how did you move your school toward this direction? So if you came, or if you come from a school that is traditionally authoritarian in their approach, what were the first things that you did to sort of get the thinking differently, taking that leap, working towards something new? Because I know that it doesn't happen overnight, and I think I, as an audience member, would be really interested to hear some of that work.
Thanks, Jenny. And I'm just going to do a shameless plug. That's what I'll be talking about at the Alberta Restorative Justice Association conference in November. But I can quickly tell you, so I was tasked with with rewriting, not really, but renewing the academic integrity policy, and I forgot what the year was. And I actually handed our provost the draft on a Friday, I think, and then I took my first restorative justice training, facilitator training, that weekend. it came back on Monday, knocked on the door, and I said, "I'm sorry, we got to pull this. We have to." And he was open to it, so that was really good. So then, and then I just started connecting with the people on campus that either teach restorative justice, so sociology departments, but also in our police and corrections office. So Michelle, that you heard speak, that's where she is. Kevin Hood was the chair of that department. They've been working teaching that for a long time. So connecting with those people, then had meetings with our Indigenous Center and actually had circles where we invited elders and other people to talk about what that would look like. And then, let me see, what was the next thing? Then it was really, so then I took quite a bit of training, also trained the trainer training so that I could train faculty members as facilitators, which often, even if they don't facilitate, what happens is it really spreads the culture and that learning and the teaching, and then they go on. And you're in nursing, right? So I know that nurses are really interested in this kind of approach, especially for their clinical placements that can have a lot of tension and so on. So it just starts to kind of grow that way. And then I think a key was to get the doubters on board, was to get them to be the representatives of the standards of academic integrity in those processes. So that we said, you think this is about letting, but that's not how we framed it, but you have the power now to control collaboratively here, of course, how easy the student gets off. So getting people involved, and then they actually experience that this really addresses things at the root, and that this really, and so the as the cliche goes, those who doubted the most became the strongest proponents. So that was one way, but it was a bottom up and a top down. So I had support from the top and then grew from the bottom up as well. Those are just a few things I think are worth.
Great. There's a couple questions in the chat. One that follows up on what Jenny just asked Paul about how do you get faculty on board? Mm-hmm.
I think that's so make them the representatives of the faculty body. So what we did for that is we've got trained adjudicators who actually adjudicate cases in our regular model code hearings, disciplinary quasi-legal procedures, but they are also then trained as and they don't need to be, but some of them are also trained as restorative conference facilitators. And they then stand in to represent the faculty body as harmed party when these things occur. That's one way, and then they spread the word and so on. And then it's just word of mouth, really, because the process actually sells itself. It's because the faculty members, as you heard some examples here, experience it as much more rewarding. We know that faculty buy-in is a huge problem with academic integrity. That if we're optimistic, 50% of faculty members reports the cases and follow policy and procedures historically. And this is a way for them to experience this as well. They've got some control over the process, and they feel it's a lot more rewarding to them as well. And they often learn from the process too. So that's just a way. Yeah, and make it easy for them. And there was one question here, how long it takes, I think. Kelly asked that. It takes about an hour and 15 minutes. It's my average, not average, sorry. That's mostly it takes about an hour and 15 minutes. And if the faculty member's never gone through the process before, then I have a 15 to 30 minute meeting with them beforehand, just to make sure they understand the process and they're actually on board with the process, which is about the time it would take for a hearing. For us, right? It's roughly the same amount of time, but the outcomes are usually a lot more meaningful.
Joel also had a question in the chat about consistency. So if you don't have a centralized office that is managing this per se, I think you kind of already touched on this, but if you could say a bit more about how you ensure consistency with these faculty members using this process.
Perfect. That's a really good question. So we actually do have a centralized office here. Everything goes through the Academic Integrity Office. And we've got now, because of the COVID spike, 30 trained faculty adjudicators who do that as part of their service load. So they adjudicate these processes. And they are the ones who then also become the faculty representatives in the restorative hearing. So they know exactly what's appropriate and what isn't. And actually, one of the questions that I didn't show in that question is that list of questions. At one point, I actually asked the adjudicator as a facilitator, I say you're an adjudicator of of these cases outside of restorative resolutions. What would an outcome normally have been had this gone, or were this still to go through a disciplinary process? Then they state what that range is, and that's the point of comparison then to find something that's consistent and fair throughout the institution for similar cases.
You've obviously done a lot of work, Paul, and that's a great example for the rest of us. I see Marcia has asked also about Ontario institutions that might already be using these methods. So I don't know if there's anyone that wants to speak to that on this call from Ontario. I'll just pause there for a second, see if there's anyone who's using these practices already that wants to say a bit more.
And Amanda, I see that Garrett has his hand up as well. Sorry, just to throw that in there.
Okay, thanks. Maybe, well, also, I wonder, Paul, if you could speak, do you know many other post-secondary institutions across Canada, perhaps, that are also employing these methods because it is so relatively new? What's your take on that?
So I know that BC is working really hard. So they have a restorative justice in post-secondary collective, I think it's called. And so there's a few institutions there that are working really hard right now, and I wouldn't be surprised if they're, that they very soon will have something in place. Otherwise, I know our friend in the US in Georgia, Courtney Cullen, they have a restorative process in place, but otherwise in Canada, I'm not sure. Now, of course, it's not new to apply restorative processes to non-academic misconduct. I think that's been around for quite a while, and there's quite a few institutions that do that, I think, but I'm not aware of any Canadian institutions that apply it to academic misconduct, but it could just be my ignorance. I'm not sure.
I have to say, I don't know of any either. So I think it's still a growing topic. Okay, Garrett, go ahead, turn your video on and mic and ask your question.
Hi there. So my video is acting up this morning, so I may have to keep it off for the time being, but Paul, a big thank you for the presentation. It was really, really great, really helpful, informative. My initial question was asked by Jenny, just kind of the transition from taking a more authoritative or punitive approach.
Mm-hmm.
So you've answered some of that. I guess my follow-up question is around training. If you can recommend some trainings that are taking place that we can join and kind of better prepare ourselves for making this transition.
Yeah, it's always a tricky part because then I feel like I'm promoting someone and not somebody else. So but I'll throw some things out there. So I know that Deb Urkus, if they still do it, Deb Urkus and Chris Hackett do some amazing training at the University of Alberta. And they've done that for a year. And I think they also accept externals. Well, they accepted me. So I know there are a few people there. They do some great training for restorative conference facilitation. Then there's the International Institute for Restorative Practices. They do a lot of different trainings as well. And Pat, I don't know her last name, the Canadian director, is very open to also visiting institutions. I'm pretty sure if you're interested, I can connect you with Pat, the Canada director, and she might even come visit if you invite her. So very interested there. Then there's a lot of training in the US as well, especially where David Karp. Now he moved from Skidmore College down to University of San Diego, and they've got a great center for restorative justice that does very good training. I hope I'm not forgetting someone. Anyway, those are some to start, get you thinking. And then if you're interested, you can also email me. Maybe I'll throw that in the chat. And maybe I can come up with a few more. There's a great. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. There's a great. Sorry, go ahead.
If we can put some of those into the chat. Just some of the things you mentioned, that would be really helpful.
Yeah.
Or if there's a follow-up email, whatever is easier. But
yeah, I'll throw some in the chat if Cory doesn't mind that I do that when while he's talking. There's also a great, I forgot the exact name, but Jennifer Llewellyn at Dalhousie runs this. I forgot the exact name, but she's like one of the authorities, Canadian authorities on restorative justice, and she runs this. It's more than a center, but I would say it's the hub of Canadian restorative justice, and it's at Dalhousie. I'm not sure whether they do training or not, but I wouldn't be surprised.
Okay, we're going to take one more quick question. Thanks, Garrett and Paul. This question is from Deborah, and Deborah is obviously thinking that there must have been some kind of an investment into transitioning to using this approach. So she's asking, do you have any knowledge to share about this transition and what can perhaps persuade institutions to switch? For instance, what is the cost benefit?
Okay. You know, I mean, there are different ways of doing this. Sorry, that was a sigh here. But really, institutions shouldn't need to be convinced to actually put money where their mouth is, and their mouth would be the mission and vision statements and the strategic plans. So really often, I think we can point to those and say, so what are we actually doing to try to promote these aspirational goals? We're talking about education, educating the whole student. We're talking about civic education, citizen-centered education. Where are we doing this, right? So I think one way to do it without being so polemic as I'm being now is to just actually connect any kind of ask to the strategic plans or the points in the strategic plan that point beyond the academic education and that actually point to the civic education of the students, the whole student education and so on. So that's, I think, one way to do it. And now it's also, there's a very clear connection to be made between EDI initiatives and restorative culture that I think would be, gain some traction nowadays. But then in general, it's not such a big investment. It doesn't need to be such a big investment. So I'm an office of one, and the institution had to invest in some training that I did. But then now as a train the trainer, I can pass that on to the faculty members and they do it as part of their service. And it's actually quite popular, right? That they do that as part of their service load instead of sitting on the 10th committee or something else. So I think the investment, the investment isn't huge. The challenge is getting the buy-in, I think, is to, and then and again, I think there it's just to start small and the process actually just does its own, like sells itself, because it just everybody feels that it's a meaningful process. I hope I answered that halfway decently there.
I think you did a great job, Paul. Listen, on behalf of everybody who's attended today, I want to extend our sincere thanks. It's been so informative and so interesting, and I'm sure that we're going to be having you back sooner than later. So look forward to that as well. And for our, yeah.
One more comment. I'm sorry.
Yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, Jenny. Because I saw the comment in the chat. So it doesn't replace, a restorative approach should not be seen to replace a disciplinary one, but it could become the default one. Sorry, and I'll stop right there. Thanks, Jenny.
That's good, great. So for the group that's on now, we're going to take a short break till about 10:15. And then we're going to have Cory speak, and he's coming from Conestoga College and going to be talking about something really pretty innovative and interesting that's going on there. So we're looking forward to that. So thank you again, Paul. I hope you stay on for Cory's part. For everyone, if you want to take a stretch and refill your coffee or tea or whatever else you're drinking, no judgments. You can drink whatever you want this time in the morning. But we'll look forward to seeing you at 10:15. It's now 10:15, so we're going to move the morning along to our second speaker. So I do hope that everybody had a chance to stretch and sort of digest a little bit of what Paul spoke to. And we're now going to turn our attentions to an Ontario colleague who's going to speak about some of the neat things that are going on at his school. So without further ado, I want to introduce you to Cory Scurr. And like Paul's bio, I know that it's been posted, so you should have that information available. But I think what's really interesting for me is that, first of all, Cory's working at a college much like myself, but also in his role, he's done some really innovative things. And one of the things he's going to talk about today is around a micro-credential that he has been working on at his school. So something that I know I found very interesting, and I'm sure that others will find interesting too. And we're looking forward to Cory's talk. So without further ado, I'm going to hand the floor over to Cory.
Thanks so much, Jenny. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Cory Scurr, and I'm
You have to
Conestoga's.
unmute, Cory.
Oh, I am unmuted. I was unmuted, and I'm still unmuted. Can you hear me now?
Yes, Cory.
Okay, perfect.
No, we
It
can't
did.
hear you.
Oh, Maddie can hear me, and Jenny cannot hear me. Can I get confirmation from others?
So I can hear you, Cory. It's
Okay.
good to hear from you.
Okay, so we're gonna blame it on Jenny.
Yeah, no, we're good. We're good. I can hear you now.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so for those of you who don't know me, my name is Cory Scurr, and I'm Conestoga's Academic Integrity Coordinator. I've been in this role for, gosh, almost 3.5 years now, and it's been an amazing journey. And this, when the AICO executive approached me about chatting about this, I was giddy. I was so excited. I thought this is going to be the easiest talk I've ever done, because it's something that it's so fun. I learn so much. I hope the participants who engage in this micro-credential learn as well, and hopefully that this group can take something from it and help promote positive change as you move forward and navigate your institution's academic integrity needs. Before I move on, though, I would like to do a land acknowledgement specific to Conestoga College. So at Conestoga College, we would like to acknowledge that the Kitchener, the Waterloo, Cambridge, and Brantford campuses are located on the Haldimand Tract, land promised to the Haudenosaunee people of 6 nations, which includes 6 miles on each side of the Grand River. This is the unceded territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee people. Okay, so here's our agenda. So we're gonna talk about why the micro-credential, why did Conestoga decide to do micro-credentials in general, and why did we decide to include the academic integrity side of things as a micro-credential. We're gonna discuss just generally what are micro-credentials, and then we're gonna get into the fun stuff, the structure of the courses. So how does each one of these courses, how is it framed, how is it structured? And then we're gonna do probably the funnest part, a sneak peek into each one of the micro-credentials that I teach, and then challenges and looking forward, and of course, followed by this Q&A. So moving forward, why the micro-credential? So first I need to qualify that. I'm technically located, the Academic Integrity Office is located in the library, right? It's the neutral ground for academic integrity, but the micro-credentials are housed within the teaching and learning department. So these folks are absolutely brilliant. And then when they approach me, I mean, we collaborate a lot. And when they approached me about doing one for academic integrity, I was eager to do this. So just keep that in mind as I'm talking about the general structure of things. And then kind of, I'm sort of slotting myself in there. So why the micro-credential? Well, first we wanted to fill this knowledge gap, right? Conestoga offers a lot of faculty workshops and participant workshops, but we were teaching and learning, and myself, we're getting the impression that this wasn't quite bringing the level that many faculty wanted, right? I deliver many workshops for programs, for schools, but we tend to have to keep these relatively high level, right? I mean, at most, I spend an hour and a half doing an hour and a half presentation for a program, and you can really, as you all probably know, just scratch the surface, particularly as it pertains to academic integrity. So there's a demand, right? There's demand for a more rich, fulsome discussion. And faculty wanted particularly deeper learning, and micro-credentials were really simmering last year, especially post-pandemic. Not to mention, there's not that much specific training on many topics, like academic integrity. So I had to do it, right? I just had to do it. And also, it really provides credibility for the faculty and for the other participants who are taking this. The faculty and participants wanted to be able to demonstrate that they had obtained the knowledge beyond just the workshop level. And because it's a pass-fail course, it really validates their knowledge, right? It's an assessed credential. And so as a result, it provides faculty the evidence of their learning, right? And of course, we can link these digital badges to their LinkedIn, to other social media profiles as proof of this knowledge acquisition. So this is kind of why we're pushing for the micro-credential, specifically in academic integrity area. So at Conestoga, essentially, the micro-credential is a certificate which confirms that the recipient has completed one or more courses that are focused on skills or skills-based competencies, etc. So these micro-credentials are relatively short. So for instance, most of them are 5 courses, some of them are only 3 courses, and they're very flexible, right? They're timely, and they're based on industry needs and educational needs, and they're designed to be very high quality and meaningful credentials. And these are offered on campus. Many of them are going to be hybrid and online. Obviously, right now they're all online, but they're going to be shifting depending on needs and demands. And the other really fun aspect of these is that various micro-credentials, if they fall into a specific kind of silo, so the one silo that I fall under is the educational silo, educational and learning silo. These can be stackable. So you take a few micro-credentials and you can combine them to form the larger credential, which is the Conestoga's post-secondary teaching certificate. So other examples of micro-credentials that participants can take are evolving assessment practices, high flex learning, intercultural teaching skills, etc. So you take those in combination, let's say with the academic integrity micro-credential, and you can get that post-secondary teaching certificate for Conestoga. And then when you complete them, you get a digital micro-credential badge, which is awarded, which is always lovely. So the academic integrity one specifically is designed essentially to facilitate a deep learning and maintain fair assessment. So to facilitate this, we have to maintain a fair assessment, and educators must inspire students to produce authentic and original work. And of course, in the blurb, I talk about all the various courses that we look at, but I don't want to do that just yet. That's what our next slide is going to do. So, like I said, I teach 5 courses, and here they are. And I promise we're going to get into sort of the nitty gritty of each course, but I'm kind of funneling the information down right now. So we went from Conestoga, how we're able to stack them, and then finally the 5 courses in academic integrity. So the first course that I offer is an overview of academic integrity. The second one is identifying plagiarism and maintaining academic integrity. This one might not be what you think it is. At least I know it's not what some faculty think it is, and I'm going to talk about some of the challenges that we face when we create these specific courses. The third one is called preventative strategies and promoting academic integrity with technology. This one terrified me to create. But I've created it, I've delivered it, we've refined it, and now I absolutely love teaching it. And the fourth one, of course, is contract cheating in higher education. You can't talk academic integrity unless we discuss the fun world of contract cheating. And last but not least, the awkward conversations, barriers to reporting academic integrity violations and talking to students. This is a light conversation. It's not a light conversation, but it's very, very fun and probably one of the most rewarding courses that we have in this package here. So next is, let's talk about the course structure. So we know that there are 5 courses, and each course follows a very similar structure. So first we have each course, of course, is 6 hours. Okay, and this spans across 2 weeks. So essentially, it's pretty compact, and we do dive into a lot of rich ideas. But of course, from an academic perspective, we're still somewhat scratching the surface. As you all know, you can spend a lot of time talking about each and every one of these topics, but it still affords us a rich platform in which we can discuss these things. So each course is 6 hours, and it spans 2 weeks. And there are synchronous portions. So during these synchronous sessions, there's a mix of, just me blabbing on, me talking, sort of lecture style, but there's also a lot of participation. And our participants, they engage in breakout sessions. We talk about, we engage in full group discussions. We do things like games and quizzes and things like that. So in our contract cheating micro-credential, we have the game, Is This Contract Cheating? So those folks who have never heard of contract cheating, their minds, they just explode when they see some of the the aspects of contract cheating and what it fully entails, because we don't even get into definitions. That's the first thing I asked them to do. We play a game and they have to decide whether or not this is contract cheating. So that's a lot of fun. Those synchronous portions are 1 hour. We like to keep it around 30%. I've had an hour and a half, and I truly love the hour and a half synchronous sessions, but for scalability and for accessibility, in terms of logistics for our faculty and our participants, we try our best to keep it at 1 hour at 2 sessions. So they're offered, let's say the one I'm teaching right now is on contract cheating. They're on Tuesdays from 1 until 2, and they always vary, right? Not every single course is taught at the same time. We also have the asynchronous portions. And this is, I really do try to mix this up, right? I don't expect faculty to and participants to only read, the latest research article. That's my job, right? So the goal is to distribute the information, as much information as I possibly can, using multiple modalities and various media types, so to speak, right? So for instance, one of the ways that we get this information out are videos. So for instance, on our course on contract cheating, participants watch the YouTube video Degrees for Sale inside the essay writing industry, Students on the Edge, which is actually a video that John Paul Fox shared at a previous AICO conference that we use, that I attended. I think that was in 2018. For our for our course on an overview of academic integrity, we have participants watch this amazing TED Talk from Dan O'Reilly, and this is called Why We Think It's Okay to Cheat and Steal Sometimes. This is a lot of fun. I mean, Dan O'Reilly is a really wonderful speaker to begin with, but it really gets us thinking about the psychological components of cheating and stealing and things like that. And then we take that conversation into a discussion group and see how we can apply that to our classroom setting. And other examples in our course on preventative strategies and promoting AI with technology, participants are encouraged to watch the webinar To eProctor or Not to eProctor. Of course, we're probably all familiar with that, which was hosted by the ICAI in November 2020. But of course, we do want to dive into some of the readings, right? And so we do have faculty read and participants read some relatively new research. And one of my favorites exists in the course, Identifying Plagiarism and Maintaining Academic Integrity. And this is the research article by Sandra Jameson and Rebecca Moore-Howard in 2019 called Rethinking the Relationship Between Plagiarism and Academic Integrity. And this generates a very rich discussion. And for lack of a better word, bringing together old school, new school kind of perspectives of what plagiarism is, and expectations around writing practice. It's a wonderful, wonderful avenue to open up that conversation. And in our course called The Awkward Conversation, participants read an article called The Emotional Labor of Academic Integrity. How does it feel? It's by Robinson and Opano. This was published in 2021 in Canadian Perspectives on Academic Integrity. And this course, I'm going to get into it a little bit later, but just talking about the emotional labors of academic integrity is a very, very rich discussion. And of course, we also have things like handouts. So there's for instance, in contract cheating, we have them look at parallels, this handout called Parallels Between Contract Cheating Industry and Organized Crime. This was distributed by the Council on Academic Integrity, the Alberta Council on Academic Integrity, and it was developed by Gru, Eaton, and Boisvert. Not only that, we have discussion forums. So in our LMS, our learning management system, we have discussion forums. And for each of these asynchronous portions, like the videos, the handouts, the readings, they're not graded, right? They're supposed to essentially help help with the synchronous learning and provide faculty and participants with a more rich discussion and more rich context and information. And we have discussion forums where they can chat, they can criticize the readings, they can challenge the readings, they can or the videos, they can agree, they can apply their own situations to them, and the conversations that unfold from these discussions are amazing. True story, I had some trepidations. I was anxious. I didn't know if many would participate in these discussions. A few micro-credentials in, a few courses in, all those anxieties were mitigated because the participation and like the deep conversation that's happening is absolutely wonderful. Last but not least, oh, excuse me, sorry. Last but not least, we have the evaluations. Now, each course is a pass-fail. So because it's an assessed credential, of course, that we need to validate their knowledge. And this is designed, of course, so faculty can demonstrate learning outcomes of each course. But I do something, I don't know if it's unique, but when I created these evaluations, I wanted it to be more than just an evaluation. Of course, we had to assess faculty's understanding of these concepts, etc., but I wanted more. So every single evaluation, the participant can actually use or take that evaluation and apply it to their teaching. We'll get into this later a little bit in detail, but essentially, for instance, in our overview, we have faculty create course announcements or course posts that help promote academic integrity. So they're not only are they demonstrating why this is going to work or why they're posting this using the theory that we learned in the course, but they can then take it and apply it and use it in their own courses. And then another fun thing is I encourage faculty to submit their submissions to the discussion forum. I have a big, important disclaimer saying, if you do submit this, please note that all faculty, all participants, including myself, have access to your submission. We can use them, we can manipulate them, and incorporate them into our own course. So participants share their evaluations for others, either just to learn from or to take and use and manipulate. So that was one of the drivers behind the evaluation, was faculty's ability to reuse their knowledge in a more concrete way. Okay, so now we are going to take a sneak peek into each one of the micro-credentials, and this is my slide where I'm delaying so I can take a quick drink of water. Okay, the first micro-credential, as I already mentioned, is called an overview of academic integrity, and each course I've tried to package it a certain way, so that's why you're seeing the the opening slide of my first synchronous session. Every single one has a sort of a different feel, a different package. So the first one is an overview of academic integrity. And some of the big ideas that we discuss in this one are frameworks of academic integrity. So we talk about the punitive framework and whether or not there's value in having a punishment-based system, or at least punishment integrated into a system. Of course, because at Conestoga we're educative and facilitative framework, we talk about that, but then we even talk about the restorative practices. Unfortunately, right now it's just from a theoretical perspective, but of course we talk about that, and if there are any ways of integrating that informally into our courses. And then we get into reasons why students cheat or might cheat. We talk about the big categories, the learning, motivation, and integrity, and we break it down, we distill it a little bit more. We talk about workload, time, potential lack of understanding about expectations. We talk about disinterest, grades, the pressure of grades, or if a faculty doesn't seem to care about academic integrity, they're much more likely to cheat, etc., and peer pressure. So we talk about a lot of really fun ideas, and how, as a faculty or as an education system, how can we mitigate these, knowing that these are very real factors that are often completely out of our control, out of our hands. How do we bring the student in? And of course, we even talk about things like the commercialization of higher education, because Aaron Bernstein's 2016 idea, how it's education system may represent sort of a capitalist system, right? Where students may actually be mimicking more of this mimicking their education on a transactional basis. How the heck how do we navigate that? If maybe some of our students are looking at it transactionally, how do we captivate our students, and how do we promote and maintain integrity within that context? And this is a brilliant segue into talking about things like statements of commitments, or more popularly known in the United States as the honor pledge. We talk about whether or not they're good or bad. I have my own opinions. Of course, it all depends on context, but we ask, how can we trigger, or how can we prime our students' moral compass? Is it using an honor pledge? Is it something a little bit more specific to your course? Is it an honor pledge right before they write an exam or submit an assignment? How can we make it really personalized for the student so that their moral compass is primed, and as a result, likely to act with more integrity and honesty? And then, of course, last but not least, we talk about strategies, and this is all kind of rolled in together, right? Promoting a culture of integrity. How do we do that? Is it more difficult to do it in a remote delivery perspective or context? And is it or, you know, versus a personal in-person delivery? We talk about some of the strengths, some of the challenges of promoting this culture of integrity, and how essentially the biggest influencing factor is the faculty, is the teacher, the one trying to draw their students in. And as I said, there's a lot of interaction, right? It's not just me droning on and on. We do a lot of breakout sessions. So for every course, I'm going to give you an example of one of the breakout sessions. So for this course, one of them is, what are strategies you use or would like to use to promote a culture of integrity? And this can be informal, like I show up 10 minutes early to all my classes and 10 minutes after, where I try to talk to students on a more informal basis. Some talk about, you know, setting up their assignments, assessment design, and things like that. So we get into some really rich discussions that way. And for the evaluation of this course, we have participants complete 3 course announcements or 3 posts. It doesn't necessarily have to be an announcement, but the overall goal behind this is that there needs to be clear messaging to students on the importance of academic integrity. But not just, and for the evaluation purpose, we don't just accept, or I don't just accept just 3 posts. We want participants to explain when they would deliver this post, or when they would provide this post, and why. So let's say it's at the beginning. This is an overview. We're talking about the college's policies and procedures and this and that. Maybe it's a little bit dry. They say, and why is it? It's to create awareness that students know about our policies and procedures. Or maybe they have a big exam coming up, or a midterm or something like that. And then they talk about the importance of independent thinking and independent work and outcomes-based education, right? So participants have to qualify essentially their posts, and that's where they really bring in a lot of the learning objectives. And the very first time we delivered it, it was just left at course announcements, which was a little bit boring. So then I've opened it up and said, you know, you can deliver these announcements or posts in any way you want. It can be a written announcement, it can be an infographic, it can be a cartoon or comic, it can be an H5P presentation. And so, some of the submissions are mind-blowing. They're so good. You can tell that faculty are invested in them because they know that they get to use it. So that's the evaluation for this one. Okay, number 2 is identifying plagiarism and maintaining academic integrity. Some of the big ideas here are we discuss plagiarism frameworks. So do we look at plagiarism from a moral issue, as a moral issue or ethical lens? Is it more of a regulatory or policy issue? Or is it an issue of learning to write in academia? You may know the perspective, or you can maybe guess the perspective that I subscribe to. Of course, it's the latter, the issue of learning to write in academia. And we really try to have a rich, fulsome discussion and pull this idea of academic integrity out of the moral framework and out of the ethical framework and into more an issue of learning to write. And of course, we define plagiarism, and it's so fun. I put them into a breakout room. They know they're going into a breakout room, and right before I say, you have 4 minutes, and I say, quick, define plagiarism, and I hit, breakout sessions, and they're like, pardon? So they have to go in a group, define plagiarism as quickly as they possibly can. 4 minutes. We come back. I say, how'd you do? Of course, everyone's yelling at me. You can't do that. That's not fair, Cory. How dare you? As a joke, right? And then we have this, we talk about, so we write all these definitions down, and I present one, and then we really tease out what it means to truly plagiarize. So we talk about big concepts like intentionality, right? Did your student intend to deceive you? And then of course we talk about things like what is too much copying, right? We start really nuancing this conversation a little bit. And then we dive into probably one of the most rich discussions. Is culture really a factor? This can be tricky to navigate sometimes. I think many participants don't mean to sound some of the ways that they do. So really being able to intervene if you think a conversation is going sideways, and really trying to qualify some of the ideas that participants are having, excuse me. So, I paint a big picture. I talk about, table manners. For instance, I try to draw this parallel with table manners. And I say things like, depending on where you're eating or who you're eating with, your table manners may have to vary, or it might vary across culture. For instance, if you go for dinner, the expectation in one area or one culture might be, you leave a little bit of food on the plate. You show your host, like, my goodness, you fed me so much, I couldn't possibly finish everything, and that's respectful. Other cultures, no, you clean your plate. If you can, you grab a piece of bread and you scrape it clean and you say, my goodness, this was so good, I had to eat every bite. Objectively, of course, neither are right, neither are wrong. They're just different depending on where you go. And that's a great segue to talk about various educational frameworks. And because we have, an outcomes-based education, we have, very clear expectations. Maybe they're not clear to some people, but we have expectations around, let's say, studying and referencing, too close paraphrasing, and things like that. And we have to be cautious that when some of our students are coming from a different educative framework, that we're not labeling that, or we're not looking at or perceiving those frameworks or those actions through an ethical and moral lens, right? Separating those and saying, just because they're different, one's not good, we're not better, we're not worse, we're just different. So talking about culture is a sometimes tricky avenue to take this conversation, but it's really advantageous, I think, in the end. And then that is a great segue into talking about various forms of plagiaries versus plagiarism, right? Which many scholars are just saying is we should eliminate from the conversation. Let's not even use the word plagiarism. Instead, we'll just call outright copying. We'll just call it copying. We'll call it cheating. And then we talk about some of the nuances of patch writing, too close paraphrasing, and things like that. But it's situated really firmly in the learning to write in academia framework. And then, of course, no conversation about plagiarism is complete unless you talk about some plagiarism detection softwares. I touch on it slightly, and I talk about it a lot more in the next micro-credential, but I felt I had an obligation to talk about it, particularly its limitations and how it's not actually detecting plagiarism, and how it really takes a viewer's close examination. One of the breakout rooms that we talk about is why students may plagiarize and why it may be increasing. So these things are, the availability of free downloads, lack of confidence, things like that, and whether or not that's actually shifting our or students' perception of their use of information. And the evaluation is a demystifying plagiarism student resource. And the overarching goal of this, of course, is to create a resource for students that may help them alleviate any potential anxieties and uncertainties that they have about plagiarism. Of course, being in my position, as well as prior experience as a writing tutor for 4 years, there are real anxieties and trepidations and fears about being labeled a plagiarist, right? So we have to try to demystify this, and that's sort of the crux of this evaluation. Faculty have to provide a clear, very non-jargonistic explanation about it, and then they have to explain why it's important to submit independent work, and then of course link these connections to the workplace if they can. Number 3, preventative strategies and promoting academic integrity with technology. And as you can probably guess, I used this presentation's slide deck. It's the same as I used for this one. I like it. I like the colors. So some of the big ideas we talk about are, using technology as a vehicle to promote learning versus an antidote to a threat, like an antidote to cheating. So we get into, this idea of an arms race, right? Is it education versus technology? Are we trying to thwart the technology, et cetera, et cetera? So we start percolating those ideas right there. And then, of course, we examine specific technologies. We look at the strengths and limitations of them. We do look at plagiarism detection software in more detail, of course, proctoring software. But not only that, we look at paraphrasing software. So not only technologies that faculty can use to help detect and discover potential misconduct, but also the technologies that students are using. And we're deciding, and this is actually what we're going to be talking about in one of the breakout discussions later, is can we neutralize some of these technologies? Should we be engaging in this arms race? Is it us versus them kind of thing? And various ways of trying to mitigate this. And the reason that I love this conversation so much is it always comes down to assessment design. We always throw out this notion of authentic assessment. If it's not us versus them, then let's just reduce that binary conversation in general. And this is what we do in this breakout room. So we discuss the idea that there exists. I asked them to discuss the idea that there exists an inherent tension between education and technology, right? So it looks at this us versus them. And my big hope in this breakout session is to sort of recalibrate the lens and suggest that perhaps it's the framework itself that's flawed, and perhaps we'd be better off looking at neutralizing the technology and rethinking our assessment design. And of course, there is the evaluation, which is the technology overview. It's a student resource. So depending on if you teach more in the STEM, if you teach more in the arts and humanities or things like that, they can use whatever technology they want, whether it's looking at a plagiarism detection software, proctoring service, maybe they're using a SharePoint site or whatever it is. And essentially they have to explain to the student why we're using this technology, what's expected of them when they're using this technology, how the faculty themselves are going to be using it. Essentially, the goal is to create transparency. Let's not hide behind technology. Let's say, hey, here's the reason why we're doing this. Let's have this open conversation, and that's the goal behind this this evaluation. Number 4. I want to say this is my most favorite, but I don't know. They're all pretty wild. Number 4, contract cheating in higher education. Of course, some of the big ideas, we look at the types of cheating services, and we look at my favorite sort of sub-favorite is looking at the aggressive marketing and advertising strategies that many of these ghostwriters use, either from a big company perspective or that freelancer, right? We have various examples of emails being sent to students, emails being sent to me, how they're able to infiltrate some of our some of the social media sites that students access. And when you talk about this in such frank, giving faculty and participants frank examples, their jaw just drops. And the reason I talk about these aggressive strategies is because it's really easy. It's really easy when talking about contract cheating to look at students as these perpetrators, like, oh, how could you? How dare you contract cheat? But when we really talk about the context in which they're existing, all of this advertising, all of these pressures, it's much easier to look at them as a victim as well. And of course, we shouldn't be looking at them as students as just victims or perpetrators. It must be much more balanced. And of course, we look at the multiple approaches to combating contract cheating. So of course, educating faculty, staff, and admin. This is one of those areas. Developing student awareness, and then of course, assessment design, and then how to actively look for contract cheating, which is another big thing we do. We explore signs of contracted work, particularly within a Conestoga specific lens. So about 2 years ago, in 2019, I developed what's called the process guide for examining potential cases of contract cheating. It talks about evidence gathering. It talks about how we follow the administrative law approach to academic integrity. And then of course, I developed this rubric at the end where faculty can try to authenticate students' learning if they do suspect contract cheating, as well as some other resources that I won't get into. Breakout room, we talk about have you ever suspected a student of contract cheating, and how did it make you feel, and how did you navigate it? And the reason I wanted to ask faculty how they felt is because when I began this role, it was, I don't want to say it was taboo. I think it wasn't discussed because the awareness wasn't there. So some faculty still feel that it's how could a student do this? And it seems so much more heavy. So talking about that, bringing that out in the open and saying, yes, this happens. You're not the only one. It's okay. Let's contextualize this. Let's validate those emotions. And then let's strategize on how to move forward. That's why we have that breakout session. And then the evaluation, of course, inspired by the International Day of Action Against Contract Cheating. We have a contract cheating awareness piece, and this is for students. And again, faculty can do this however they want. H5P, infographic, video. There are so many amazing videos that faculty essentially submitted, just talking about the importance of creating awareness, and which is the crux of this entire course is creating awareness, faculty awareness, that they can spread it to students and create more student awareness. Mindful of time, I think we're doing okay. Last but not least is the awkward conversation. Barriers to reporting academic integrity violations and talking to students. This is a rich discussion, I'm not gonna lie. We talk about the interrelationship of emotional issues in reporting academic integrity violations. So dealing with the system, which is amazing since, as my position, I am the system incarnate, right, in human form. So faculty are having very open and honest conversations about how it makes them feel when they have to navigate this, right? We talk about it from a workload perspective, how it may impact their professional role and their identity, how it may impact their relationship with students, and then the norms of academic integrity from an institutional perspective. Of course, we do an overview of institutional processes and expectations. So what is expected of a faculty at Conestoga, and how do we navigate that, and how it makes them feel essentially. And then we try to always encase the conversation in an educative framework. So for instance, what's that initial conversation look like with your students? I provide a template. Here's some things that we should consider. Here's some verbiage that we can use. Here's how we can mitigate those anxieties, those anxiety-inducing emails that students receive. How can we best communicate to students that, whoa, don't worry, we're going to get through this together in a very forward-thinking and progressive way. So we talk about those types of strategies in this. And what I was most afraid of with this was that this would just be a rant session. So we always really wanted to ground it. We wanted to validate those emotions, but always bringing it back to why what we're doing is important, why it's okay to suspect something, right? You don't have to feel gross inside. If you suspect somebody cheating, that doesn't make you a bad person. Having that conversation. And we just have a frank conversation in our breakout room. What is your biggest barrier to reporting academic integrity violations, if you have one? Some part-time faculty may say, it's just a time issue. I don't have the time, or I don't want to. I'm afraid what my colleagues might think if I'm that person who doesn't or does report these, things like that. And it's just a really rich conversation. And the evaluation for this one is probably the hardest, I think, and this is a hypothetical program or department presentation. So I create the context. I say you've been invited to your program meeting because, of course, you've taken this amazing micro-credential, and now you're an expert, and you've been invited to chat and discuss with your peers some various barriers to investigating and reporting academic integrity violations, but more specifically, why it's important to have high standards and why it's important to maintain these academic standards in your program. We then ask them to share some resources with faculty that might help mitigate some of those barriers or get rid of them altogether. And the main goal of the hypothetical presentation is to create, again, awareness for faculty and leave the audience feeling encouraged and supported and empowered. So those are the 5 courses. But there are, these courses did not come without their challenges, and they still do, and it wouldn't be worthwhile if they weren't challenging. But remember, as I said, this is sort of housed under the umbrella of teaching and learning. And one of the challenges that we experience, like collectively, myself as well as teaching and learning consultants, is that these participants and faculty found it difficult to shift from the workshop perspective to the micro-credential perspective, right? If you don't complete the work and you don't submit the evaluation, you fail. And that goes on their student transcript. So really making sure that we are transparent about this, letting faculty know that, hey, you need to drop this if you're not able to do that. Things like that. So shifting faculty, right? They wanted these, but transitioning them from workshop to micro-credential sort of mentality was pretty challenging. From my vantage point, I felt, excuse me, I should be putting these up. So shifting faculty mindset, right? I felt under the microscope, but this is okay. And what do I mean by feeling under the microscope? It was very clear that these have to be exceptionally done, right? We have to demonstrate excellence. If this is coming from teaching and learning, we need to be leading by example, and I need to be doing that as well. And otherwise, you will be called out on it if you miss something, which I utterly respect. So the challenge and the pressure that brought was very real for myself, particularly, and of course, satisfying all learners. The one I delivered the identifying plagiarism one a few times, and the first one, I'll fully admit, was a flop. I was not happy with it. Didn't get the greatest reviews, and so I just had to reconceptualize. But the thing that I found interesting was that many faculty went into that looking for essentially coming up with tactics on how to identify plagiarism. Right? I just want to know how to spot it and nail them, kind of thing. I'm being slightly facetious with my language, but that's essentially some of the feeling I got. So how can I then reframe the entire course so that a faculty isn't less dissatisfied? They're not left dissatisfied with the presentation. Instead, we had to reframe. So essentially, I flipped the course on its head and created a theoretical framework so that faculty can say and start challenging maybe their own conceptions and preconceptions about what plagiarism is. So satisfying all learners that way was difficult. It still is difficult. You can never satisfy everyone, unfortunately, but that's a challenge that I relish. And then a very sort of practical one was meeting capacity. This is not really a complaint, but I mean, we've had over 1,500 registrants since it began in the spring. And myself, I've had to, we were going to cap them at 25, and then they asked me to increase them to 35 participants and then 45 for a few of them. And that is a lot, and that is overwhelming. But I mean, it's a great problem to have, but it is definitely logistical and just an objective challenge. So I think I have 1 minute remaining. This is probably the best timed presentation I've ever done in my life, so I'm happy about that. So closing remarks. I will fully admit that I have my own agenda, right? My position as the integrity coordinator is relatively unique, right? There's only one academic integrity coordinator working directly with students. I'm lucky enough to have an academic integrity associate who's absolutely brilliant. But I'm working more with faculty right now. So in my position, I have no power, right? I have no authority. I don't tell people what to do. Instead, I'm on the side of evidence, right? And also, given my position, I do provide guidance. I do provide advice in my hopes, and I strive to provide consistency and fairness across the institution. But think about it, that's typically a reactionary corner that I'm standing in, right? It's when something has expected, when misconduct is already expected. So it's inherently reactionary. How do you deal with, how do you navigate, how do you work through the misconduct? So what's really amazing about these micro-credentials is that they really afford me an opportunity to be proactive with faculty and with participants as we navigate this, truly often muddy terrain of AI, right? It offers a really genuine and wonderful forum to have open discussions and open and frank, difficult conversations. And not only that, it provides a springboard to be self and institutionally reflective about things like course assessments, like things about assessment design and course design and program design. But most importantly, it really provides me, albeit in its very small way, a chance to really try to evoke positive change. And I think that's why I love doing these, and that's why I think they are so important. So thank you so much for your time listening to me drone on, and I'm more than happy to take some questions now.
Thank you so much, Cory. That was so interesting. So the chat box is open if you want to pop questions in for Cory. And maybe what I can do is just get us started. I'm interested, Cory, in sort of the practical approach in terms of how does Conestoga manage their breaches to academic integrity? So is it a centralized process, or do you have individual programs? I want to say programs. And at Humber, we have faculties, but with individual processes within those faculties. So is it a centralized one, or are there different ways of schools actually managing their breaches to integrity?
Yeah, great question. So we have an overarching policy framework and process framework for the entire college to do, for the entire college and faculty to take. But it's very similar to many institutions where it's the faculty first. The faculty are the ones that navigate it, they identify it, and they investigate it, and that's one of my roles. I house, or I field about 300 to 350 consultations every semester, big or small, just trying to help faculty navigate these. But overall, there is not specific school policy and procedure. It's a college-wide policy and procedure. I hope that helps, Jenny.
Yep. I'm just looking at the chat box now. So lots of people with positive things to say about the presentation. So it was truly appreciated. It looks like there's one question here from Joel, and who's asking, on average, how many faculty members sign up for these courses, and what is the interest level?
Yeah, thanks, Joel. So the interest level is very high. I'm not trying to be overly confident, but it's very high. Like I said, we tried to cap them at 25. That was the initial sort of benchmark, and then a few of them have had to be increased to 35. A couple of them even 45, which is probably too much, and they fill up very quickly. So at the beginning of the semester, we opened up all 5 of these courses, and they had 20, 30 participants within a few weeks, which is really lovely. I'm hoping that we can maintain that. I can't speak for all of the other micro-credentials, but I know that they're being very well received. Like I said, over 1,500 participants so far, and they're not just open to Conestoga faculty. They're open to others. Of course, other faculty or participants have to pay for it, and these are free to Conestoga. So the interest is great. And I'd say on average, I have between 20 to 25 faculty per course every 2 weeks.
Perfect. And so do you, in order to support your own staff, would you limit the external participants?
That's a good question. We actually haven't had any external participants yet. So Amanda, what is the cost? So in other words, Jenny, I don't know how we'd navigate that. And again, that's a little bit out of my jurisdiction. That would be up to teaching and learning and the director and how they would do that. But I know that they would love to have external participants, of course. What is the cost for outsiders? I don't know. I think it's 150. Please do not quote me on that. I should have had that information in my back pocket. My apologies.
So I just open it up. Are there any other questions before we take a break? And just to remind you that one of the groups that we're going to be having after the break is around, some of the content that that Cory talked about specific to technology and how to embrace it rather than run from it in terms of working with academic integrity. So final questions for Cory?
We do have one from Sandra in the chat. It's not necessarily addressing the micro-credential, but it is the final decision regarding any sanction with faculty following my guidance, or is it pending? Does it need to be approved by the chair, the dean, or the AVP? And that's a really great question. And that actually depends. So depending on the level that the faculty has, or the category, we have 4 categories at Conestoga. Depending on the category and penalty applied, it may lie with the faculty. And of course, we do encourage. It's not necessary that they consult with me, but we do encourage them to consult with someone, program manager, chair, colleague, myself. Maybe not colleague, a program manager or chair. And then they can file. But depending on the category, so for instance, if it's a category 3 and there's a higher penalty that the faculty is recommending, which is either a 0 on the assessment worth 20% or more, or a 0 in the course, it has to be approved by the chair. So in other words, this isn't a unilateral decision because they are big decisions. These are very big decisions, and we need to be approaching them very holistically. And this is often where I'm brought into the conversation. So they'll recommend this, and the chair and I will chat, or we'll have a conversation. So it kind of depends on the category. I hope that helps. Pat, another amazing question. Sorry, Jenny, if you don't mind. How much time is spent on the importance of assessment design, and what do you hope? More questions on what do you hope are the outcomes for the participants in relation to this? Well, that's a loaded question, but a wonderful one. It depends on the group in terms of how much time. So I had this let's call them a cohort of a group of faculty that kind of went through all 5, and when we spent a lot of time talking about assessment design and authentic assessment, and how this is probably a motivation. Of course, I want us all to be reflective. My hope is that we're reflective on assessment design. And ultimately, what's the goal? What's the purpose of our assessment? Do we need to be rethinking our assessments? So in fact, I just had an amazing conversation with one of the teaching and learning consultants who does a micro-credential all on assessment. And we're saying that we need to join forces. We need to come together and come up with a new micro-credential on academic integrity assessment design and authentic assessment. So that hopefully will maybe be in the future. So my hope at this level is to get the gears going. Of course, I only have 6 hours per course, so we don't get to dive into that too much, but it's at least to be self-reflective and maybe even challenge some of the assessments that we're currently using.
Okay. I don't see any other questions. It looks like Amanda has popped in a bit of information for the participants about our after break activities. So, just so you can make some decisions or think about where you want to land when we come back. But I did want to take just a moment, Cory, to thank you so much for what a great presentation. And really incredible work. I mean, you can see the chat box and people are really, really identifying with what you talked about and the need for it. So thank you very much for sharing that. It was a really wonderful presentation. And I hope you'll be back, and I hope you'll get ready for lots of inquiry, because I'm sure people are going to be contacting you to talk a little bit more, maybe in smaller groups around the work that you've done. It's been really great. That being said, thanks again, Cory. And this is time for us to take a little break. We're going to come back, convene at 11:20, and give you an opportunity to break into smaller groups to have some more focused and direct conversation about different topics that may interest you. So we will see you all back at 11:20. Thanks again.